And on that note, I'm going to pass it off to Jeanine and let her have the show.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And Michael, thank you so much for having me. Um, I figured since it's National Women's History Month, I would talk about my suffrage project that I did. So I'm going to go ahead and start screen sharing now. So let me do that. Okay, do this. Okay, sorry, there was a little warning on there about recording. So anyway, um, my name is Jeanine Michna-Bales, for those of you that don't know me, and I am based in Dallas, Texas. And I am going to scroll down here. Is it going? Good. Okay. So I did a project from 2016 to 2020 that was entitled Standing Together, Inez Milholland's Final Campaign for Women's Suffrage. In 2016, while I was home visiting family in Indiana, I found myself digging through the correspondence file folders from the Women's Franchise League of Indiana at the Indiana Historical Society. I'm not quite sure what compelled me to do this, but I had been thinking about women's rights and the lack thereof of them for a long time. I had learned a little about the women's rights, particularly the American women's suffrage movement, in school. Why was the history of a century-long political struggle not better known? Why didn't I have a more complete understanding of what women had to fight for in order to secure the rights that I and other American women have today? I wondered how we could bring these heroic women back into our collective history. In the 1910s, the League was campaigning for a statewide referendum to grant women the right to vote. They were sending letters with pledge cards to every influential man in the state, asking them to call for a special session in order to vote on the matter. Every response was saved and cataloged in file folders. A few expressed support for the referendum, but I was dumbfounded as I read page after page filled with derogatory remarks and stereotypes about women, proudly signed in elegant script at the bottom, foreshadowing the measure's defeat. I began delving into the annals of women's rights in the United States, including women's enfranchisement. The quest for women's suffrage in the US was a multi generational movement, rife with power struggles and racism that spanned more than a century. Countless women comprised the movement. How could I possibly find a way to visually draw people into the women's suffrage story? Then I stumbled across a banner that was carried by a now little known figure who was at the forefront of the movement in the early 20th century, Inez Milholland Boissevain. She was born in 1886 and she died in 1916. The first and last lines of the banner read, "Forward out of darkness, forward into light." I believe that the universe works in mysterious ways. My previous body of work was entitled Through Darkness to Light, Photographs Along the Underground Railroad. So when I saw that banner, I knew that Inez was going to be the person that would help me personalize and visualize a movement of generations of women. As I researched Inez's life, I became completely enamored with her. Driven by her belief that women were equal to men, this epitome of the new woman challenged traditional gender norms in the early 1900s by becoming a lawyer, activist, war correspondent, suffragist, and orator. She wrote speeches, letters, plays, and articles arguing that women were worthy of the right to vote. As I read her words, often in her own handwriting, I could almost hear her voice in my head enumerating the ways in which women were competent, capable, intelligent, and active contributors to modern society, thoughtfully and methodically countering each argument that attempted to deny a woman's equal status to men in the world. Sometimes I felt that, if the dates were removed, we wouldn't know that her words had been written more than a century earlier. When she saw an injustice, she threw herself full force into fixing it, from labor laws and prison reform to war and women's rights. She fought tirelessly to dispel the stereotypes about women she kept butting up against, and each rejection only fueled her determination more. She was turned away by 3 Ivy League law schools and denied access to the front lines as a war correspondent, both because of her gender. She graduated with a law degree from New York University in 1912 and later practiced law despite the fact that it was a male dominated profession at the time. In this photo from 1913, it was the 1913 National American Women's Suffrage Association parade in Washington, D.C. Inez described her attire as something suggesting the free woman of the future, crowned with the Star of Hope, armed with the Cross of Mercy, circled with the blue mantle of freedom, breasted with the torch of knowledge, and carrying the trumpet, which is to herald the dawn of a new day of heroic endeavor for womanhood. Inez helped fellow suffragists Alice Paul and Lucy Burns form the National Women's Party, whose goal was a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. Frustrated by the lack of progress in a state by state method of securing the vote for women, as well as President Woodrow Wilson's inaction on the matter, the party sought to put their fate directly into women's hands. The NWP mounted a radical campaign to send a dozen suffragists from the East out to 12 Western states and territories: Alaska, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming, states where women had the right to vote. Their request was simple but substantial. Put aside all other political agendas during the 1916 presidential election, then cast a protest vote against Wilson, the Democratic incumbent who was running for a second term against the Republican candidate Charles Evan Hughes, and other Democrats also running for office, so for Senate and Congress. Knowing their efforts would not likely change the outcome of the election, they nonetheless wanted to ensure that President Wilson would not win on account of women's votes in the suffrage states. The goal was to force him to acknowledge the bloc of Western women who would vote to stand together with their unenfranchised sisters in the East, and in turn live up to his democratic ideals by passing a national suffrage amendment in his next term. Oh, on the right is a newspaper article from Chicago, and Inez was truly ahead of her time. In this newspaper article, you can see that she wants everything to be 50-50, and the newspaper is lambasting her for that case. Um, oops, yeah, okay. This is a letter that Inez had written to her husband. So during the entire campaign, she was sending letters and newspaper clippings back to him. Inez met Eugene Boissevain when they were both aboard a transatlantic ship in 1913. And basically, he could be described as her soulmate. He was a Dutch coffee importer, and after a whirlwind courtship during which she proposed, they enjoyed a marriage that, according to their letters, was based on equality and a mutual admiration for one another. This is I guess, an image taken from the Suffragist magazine that was covering the National Women's Party campaign. Using primary sources, including personal correspondence back and forth between Inez and her husband Eugen, the Suffragist magazine, local newspapers, and National Women's Party papers, as well as books and other research, I was able to piece together the route that Inez and her sister Vida followed during the 1916 National Women's Party Western campaign. Inez was appointed the special flying envoy. This is a route. This is a map, a 1916 railroad map that I took, and I went ahead and photographed it because it was so fragile. Then I purposely printed it out and cut it in half and then stitched it back together to kind of make it look like a corset. And the fact that the Eastern states were asking for the Western states' help. Um, and then I went ahead and hand embroidered their route into the map. So, departing Chicago on October 6th, Inez and Vida embarked on a grueling campaign traversing 8 states in 21 days, only a portion of the 12 states they were meant to cover. Inez delivered some 50 speeches while battling chronic illness and lack of sleep. Her 3 week itinerary, brutal even by today's travel standards, consisted of street meetings, luncheons, railroad station rallies, press interviews, teas, auto parades, dinner receptions, speeches in the West's grandest theaters, and even impromptu talks on the train while on the way to our next destination. The images in this series follow the campaign trail and are made up of both landscape, still life, and reenactment images. Inez described the landscape in vivid detail in her letters to Eugen and expressed a desire on multiple occasions to return to explore the West with him. And I purposely asked women of different ages and races to stand in for Inez and her fellow suffragists, since ultimately they gave all women the right to vote. Although some women were forced to wait until as late as 1965 and in 1962 to cast a ballot due to state election laws and intimidation prohibiting people of color or Native Americans or Indigenous people from voting. This image is entitled Ballot Box, circa 1910. Ready for battle. And this is a newspaper, I guess, coverage of her leaving New York on the start of the trip. And this is Farewell, Grand Central Terminal, New York. Arrival, Chicago, Illinois. Inez and her sister Vida, traveling via train, left New York City on October 4th, 1916, stopping first in Chicago to meet with Alice Paul at the National Women's Party headquarters. In a letter to her husband, Inez wrote that she had a horrible journey to Chicago and was sickest every bit of the way. She attributed her pain in head and shoulders and back, coupled with dizzy headaches, to the train, writing that she would get used to it after a bit. She saw reporters in the afternoon and then saw the first of many doctors during the trip who said that her tonsils were in awful shape. The night before the campaign began, the Milholland sisters had drinks and dinner with their father, John. He would later express concern for Inez's health in his diary pages. Something Blue, Lake Michigan, Chicago, Illinois. This is a quote from Inez's speech that was in the Suffragist October 14th, 1916, along the campaign trail. What is your answer, women with the ballot? Are you going to lick the hand that smites you like the hounds? Standing Together, Grant Park, Chicago, Illinois. This image was taken in 2018. Checking in, National Women's Party headquarters, Stevens Building, Chicago, Illinois, also photographed in 2018. Dinner and drinks with Vida and their father at the Blackstone Hotel, Chicago, Illinois, 2018. 1,735 miles covered so far, Wyoming, 2012 is when I took the image, but okay. Union Pacific Passenger Depot, Cheyenne, Wyoming. They arrived after midnight on Saturday, October 7th, at their first stop in Cheyenne and were met by a local National Women's Party member who walked them over to the Plains Hotel. Inez said she felt like the devil in the morning, but got better during the course of the day. She spoke in the afternoon to a crowd at the hotel, and Vida, who was an accomplished lyric soprano, sang. This is Suffrage Dress. In the margin of one of her letters to Eugen, she mentioned that her attire was just right. A Gift of Flowers train platform, Glens Ferry, Idaho. Along the route, they had publicized where they were going, and so local suffragists would show up at the train stations, and the admirers would greet her at various stops and give flowers and fruit baskets. This is the Snake River near Twin Falls, Idaho. and you can kind of see the river out the side of the train tracks. Penny Theater, Boise, Idaho. The Kimmerer Republican, Wyoming newspaper, and this is from October 13th, 1916. In Pocatello, the meeting at the Yellowstone Hotel was so crowded that 300 men gave up their spots for women. After the meeting, Inez and Vita boarded a mail train and rode without food to Boise, where they headed to the Penny Theater. Inez spoke with Sarah Bardfield, a poet and suffragist who had driven an automobile cross country the year before collecting signatures on a suffrage petition, to an audience, and they both spoke to an audience filled to the limit with scores standing. Inez remained on stage until 10:30 p.m. answering questions. Inez, Vita, and Sarah celebrated the successful meeting before the sisters boarded a 2 a.m. train to Portland, Oregon. It was a wonderful meeting, about 1,500, and I landed it. I am so happy, she wrote to Eugen. This is entitled A Wonderful Argument. In a handwritten letter to Eugen dated October 10th, 1916, Inez discussed having a wonderful argument with the conductor and Pullman car conductor and says she got them over to our side. And this is what she actually said. And then we have approaching Portland, Oregon. As the train made its way down the Columbia River into Portland, the sunset, and she quoted this, or I'm quoting this from her letter, the sunset splashed the mountains and river with crimson. Upon their arrival at Union Station, Inez and Vita were greeted by reporters and photographers who followed them to the Multnomah Hotel, where a banquet for 500 was given in honor of Inez. Another 200 people had to be turned away. Inez shook hands with guests after dinner and huddled one on one with journalists until well after midnight, when the sisters caught the next train to Seattle, arriving at King Street Station swathed in fog just after the crack of dawn. They were escorted to a luncheon attended by 100 prominent citizens at the Sunset Club. Then Inez spoke at the Land Show Expo, headed back to the Sunset Club for a banquet dinner, and ended the day at Moore Theater for a mass meeting of nearly 3,000 people. She lingered on the stage of the packed theater, answering questions until she was dragged away by Vita. As the journey continued, her confidence as an orator was growing. In a letter handwritten on Sunset Club letterhead, she wrote to Eugen, "Had a marvelous meeting last night, quite the best yet. Even I was satisfied. I'm learning and getting to be a real speaker." These are lyrics from the Song of the Free Woman, written by Sarah Bardfield and set to La Marseillaise. So it says, we come at last, night's portal we have passed. We come, trust thou our might. Thou too shall walk in light. This image is entitled, We Will Not Fall Down. In a letter from October 8th, 1916 to Eugen, Inez mentions that doctors have prescribed her a combination of arsenic and strychnine and iron that she thought was helping her. This image is entitled Fever, Aches, and Pains. Don't know if it was the medicine or the fever or possibly the combination of both. And this image is entitled Arsenic and Strychnine, the Sunset Club, Seattle, Washington. Apparently, you can buy arsenic and strychnine pills on eBay. I wouldn't suggest it, but I did for the photo shoot. They were chocolate covered, no less, which I thought was a little frightening. This is Marching Onward in Washington. She would continue to take the pills throughout the tour, sometimes doubling and tripling the doses just to make it through the day. She was determined not to quit. Several other women already had due to the grueling pace that Alice Paul all had them on. One of them was Harriet Staunton Blatch. It was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter. She was in her 60s, and after about, I think, maybe a week on the campaign trail, she said that she had to pack it up and go home. She said, and quoted saying, "Let the younger women take care of it." This is from one of Inez's speeches. As you act in the next months, so the fate of women will be determined in the coming year. You must say to the rulers of the nations, you cannot proceed without us. Inez and Vita went to Spokane, where the press coverage of an afternoon reception for more than 300 women at the home of Mrs. Austin Corbin II was positive and mentioned the decorations of huge brown baskets banked with barberries, Oregon grape, and yellow maple leaves, and red and blue berries. The more seasoned suffragists described their many years of battle as a good fight and asserted that this will go down in political history under the title of First Battles of the Women's War. Later that night, the standing room only sign was dusted off and hung up 30 minutes before the meeting opened at the Strand Theater. After delivering a speech to a crowd of 1,800 people, Inez asked the men in attendance if she was on the right track. A chorus of baritone voices responded with, "Yes, you're all right." This image is entitled Women Hold Up Half of the Sky. In another letter to Eugen, dated October 9th, 1916, I found a great crowd at the station. I couldn't think why until I heard someone say, "There she is." Then I suspected. My heart sank, I don't mind telling you. Then the brakeman and porter said, "They're looking for you." So I went to the back of the train and made a speech, fairly good. Inez and Vita traveled to Cut Bank and Shelby, both in Montana, for a train platform speech and street rally, then continued on to Great Falls, Montana, where they were greeted by a large crowd and the Black Eagle Brass Band. The automobile that escorted them to the Palace Theater, where Inez spoke that night to a crowd of 1,100 people, was part of an auto parade which included a car filled with Blackfeet Indians in full war paint. They ate dinner and went dancing, but the following morning, Inez awoke with a fever and sore throat and had to force herself to get ready for 2 meetings in Helena, Montana. When she became so weak she couldn't stand, she considered quitting for the first time. This image is entitled Whistle Stop Speech, Cut Bank, Montana. Amber Waves of Grain, Montana. Leaving Helena, also in Montana. A Storm is Building, Ogden, Utah. In another letter dated October 17th to Eugen, she wrote, "I can't wait to get to Salt Lake City, for I expect to find there a telegram and a letter from you." And this is a telegram from Eugen, Salt Lake Union Pacific Railroad Station, Utah. Dawn, Nevada. A day later, the Milholland sisters stopped high in the Sierra Nevada mountains in Winnemucca, Nevada. Continuing through the state via train, they stopped briefly in Reno and motored to Virginia City, where promptly at 4 o'clock, the mine whistles blew, the school bells rang, and even fire whistles welcomed them. After Inez delivered a speech to 500 residents in the street, women rushed to the town hall to register to vote. Continuing on to Silver City for another street meeting, the Sunset, oh goodness, I thought I had muted that, sorry. Um, the sunset, oh, so as they continued for another street meeting, the sunset dyed the mountains surrounding the city a dramatic women's party purple, according to a report Vita sent back to Alice Paul. The next stop was Carson City, uh, where Inez spoke to a great crowd at the Grand Theater. Around 1 a.m., the sisters started the bitterly cold drive back down the mountain to Reno. This is the Nevada State Journal um, from October 15th, 1916. And this is an automobile caravan from this train station to Reno, Nevada, and the Suffrage Mountains. And we actually, I had a 1915 Ford Model T that was part of the museum in Sacramento, and we took that out on the road for the photo shoot. And we were sitting in the front of the car driving over, and it was very bouncy, and the gas tank is actually underneath the seat, so you're smelling all of these gas fumes. And I asked the driver how long he thought it would take to get down from the mountain. And he said probably about maybe 2.5, 3 hours. And the car that she rode in was open, and it was October, very chilly. Um, the headlights probably would have only worked for an hour, so they would have been making their way back down through switchbacks very slowly. So it was amazing the kind of the process that they went through for this campaign. This image is entitled Lifeline. One unfortunate consequence of Inez's marriage to Eugen was the loss of her American citizenship. Although she was born in the United States, Inez was compelled by a law passed in 1907 to become a citizen of her husband's country, thereby also losing any possibility of voting. New York State did not grant women the right to vote until 1917, but had they before she died, she would not have been able to vote. Back then, a man who married a foreign woman at the time did not lose their American citizenship. Eugen offered to become an American citizen in order for her to gain her legal status back, but she refused, saying that somehow they would get the law changed. It did not change until 1922 when Congress passed the Cable Act. This is from the Oakland Tribune in California, October 22nd, 1916. This is preparing for a speech, the Palace Hotel, San Francisco, California. In a campaign report, Vita noted that Inez barely had time to put on her white dress prior to being escorted to the ballroom for her speech in San Francisco, where she declared, President Wilson says he must be bound by the provisions of the 1916 platform of the Democrats, provisions he wrote himself. Must he be bound by his own limitations, I ask you? Is that the reason for his refusal to see the light? The suffragist reported that as many people crowded in as were turned away for the 2 hour meeting of 1,500 people. Hundreds packed the platform after Inez's speech, and she remained on her feet, fielding questions and shaking hands for an additional 3 hours. Back to the city, leaving Phoebe Hearst's estate, Pleasanton, California. Both her and Inez went over to Phoebe's estate for tea. And Phoebe Hearst of the Hearst Media Empire, her son, she was one of the main suffragists that helped get the law, state law passed in California. And this is the Los Angeles Daily Times, October 24th, 1916. Arriving in Los Angeles on October 23rd, Inez delivered her last speech to about 1,000 people at Blanchard Hall, where she collapsed on stage while speaking. She returned 15 minutes later, sitting in a chair to finish. Her final public words were President Wilson, how long must this go on? No liberty. Let me repeat, we are not putting our faith in any man or in any party, but in the women voters of the West. And this image is entitled Fading Rose. And then this image is entitled Transitioning. Although she tried to be indefatigable, according to the Los Angeles Daily Times, Inez's rapidly deteriorating health forced her to stop campaigning, and she died only 1 month later on November 25th, 1916, at the age of 30, a martyr of the American suffrage movement. The suffragists devoted most of its pages to their fallen comrade for the next issue. Inez, when they covered her Christmas Day memorial procession that formed at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and marched across the Capitol Plaza to Statuary Hall. She was the first suffragist to be honored with a memorial service at the Capitol. Many noted suffragists spoke, including Maud Younger, who delivered this memorial address. Inez Milholland stood for women. She lived for women. She died for women. She is in the heart of every woman whose heart beats for tomorrow. That tomorrow is clearer and nearer Sorry, it chokes me up every time I read this. Because Inez Milholland lived. We, her comrades and friends, acknowledge the great debt we owe her. In the name of all women, we accept her gift and proudly honor her triumphant death. May we have the courage and the devotion to follow where she has led. This photographic essay is a tribute to the American women who paved the way for us. From courageous role models like Ida B. Wells to countless women whose names we have yet to learn, many women from all walks of life fought for a woman's rights to vote. To reflect this, I asked women of all ages and backgrounds to represent Inez, her sister Vida, and their fellow suffragists in these images of standing together. I approached the digitally captured images that comprise the series in two ways. The landscape photos depict what I imagine Inez saw with her own eyes as she traveled through the rugged West a century ago. The autochromes look back at history through enactments and still life images of moments in her journey. Auguste and Louise Lumiere were at the vanguard of photography at the turn of the 20th century, and they patented the first commercially successful color process in 1907, which they called the autochrome Lumiere. Combining grainy potato starch and soot onto backlit glass plates, the autochrome was the most widely used process for capturing color for about 30 years. By merging their historical look with modern technology, I'm attempting to bridge the gap between the suffrage movement and our current moment. Though we have come a long way, we must recognize that we stand on a precarious ledge. The full enfranchisement of American women took well over a century. Why did it take over 70 years from the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, for the 19th Amendment to be passed? Why did the amendment only apply to white women? Indigenous American women were unable to vote in every state until 1962, and Black women could not universally cast ballots until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And even then, it was tough. Although the principle of equal rights is enshrined in America's founding documents, those rights have historically been reserved for certain groups, mainly white men, and have been violently withheld from many people, most grievously from immigrants and Black and Indigenous Americans. As we look back at history, of the fight for women's rights, we ought not to take for granted universal suffrage. Even today, states including Texas, North Carolina, and Georgia are gerrymandering, purging voter rolls, changing voter identification requirements, and understaffing, closing, or moving polling locations, all of which jeopardize voting rights. It is clear that we still have work to do. And as Inez would have wished, I truly hope that we all continue to stand together, shoulder to shoulder, using our voices with courage and devotion as we move forward out of error and forward into light. And this was all of this work was captured in a book entitled Standing Together. And it was released by MW Editions in 2021. And if you're interested in ordering a copy, you can go to mweditions.com. And then there is a project website for the for this project. So if you want to learn more about it, it has traveling exhibition information. So the traveling exhibition, I'm excited to announce, will be launching this fall. Knock on wood, I have my first venue lined up, and it's local here in Irving, Texas. I'm based in Dallas right now. There is a book link on the project website that will take you to the MW editions if you are interested in ordering the book. There are also some of the project images. There's a background and overview of the project, some of more glimpses into the historical research and ephemera that went into making the project, a voting rights timeline. There are some educational resources for teachers, so please share. There's a glossary, a bibliography, suggested reading, tons of online links within that suggested reading, lesson plans, and some other online teacher resources. There is 19th Amendment Centennial Celebration resources. And some of those are, I think a lot of those links are still up. I'm going to need to come back through and see if they've changed or whatever. But that's kind of where some of the stuff for the teacher resources was coming from. Different states posted things. And then there are some, I guess, behind the scenes images of making of the project. But does anybody have any questions for me? Happy to discuss Inez and the project and making of it. If it's you know, technological technology questions, happy to answer those too.
Well, I had a question about your process.
Mhm.
I noticed that a few of the images had scratches or, now, did you do that to the file itself, or did you use like an overlay or something like that?
Was actually an overlay.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
found, I guess it was a plug into Photoshop to do the autochrome, you know,
Mhm.
applications. So I had my digital file and then I ran it through like 3 different times and merged all those layers together. And then I had a scratchy overlay that I applied to it. And then the way the images will be presented for the traveling exhibition, since it is going to be traveling for at least 5 years, I'm not going to have any glass or plexi in there just because it can get damaged. So what I'm going to do is I'll be mounting the images and then I'll be using like semi-gloss fixative on, or actually glass fixative to kind of mimic what, because an autochrome was printed on glass, but I'm printing on paper, but at least maybe that shininess will nod to that historical aspect.
Yeah, so if I heard you right, you found a Photoshop plugin that emulates autochrome.
Mhm.
Wow, that's very cool. Do you have a link for that or someplace?
It was in my old Photoshop, so I'm gonna have to go back and look and figure out where that is. But yeah, if you send me an email, I'll dig for it and I can send you the information.
Give me your email so I can write it down here
Let me see if I can put it here. I'm gonna try to. Here we go. I'm gonna put it in the chat.
in the chat. I can find the chat. Okay.
Like if I can spell photography, sorry. My fingers
Uh,
are faster than I think they are.
let's
Okay,
see.
there you go.
Okay, let me look and see. Hmm.
There's Jeanine at jmbalesphotography.com.
Say it one more time. I'm sorry.
Jeanine at jmbalesphotography.com.
J.M. Vales, V-A-I-L.
Bales.
B is in boy.
Uh-huh.
Bales photography, right?
Yes, so jmbalesphotography.com.
Mm-hmm.
And Jeanine is spelled Jeanine.
Oh, I'm sorry, A-N.
Jeanine.
Uh-huh.
It's a tough one.
Yeah.
Jeanine,
Okay.
I have a
Yeah.
question. It's Linda. So I was wondering how, or if you have any information of how the Spanish flu of 1918 affected her journey, or did it at all?
Oh, then so it was after, so they were in 1916. So they were pre-Spanish flu, but it actually had a huge damper on the suffrage movement and them trying to campaign, trying to get the amendment ready and everything. So yeah, it did impact the suffrage movement, just she was earlier. So good
I
question.
get it. Thanks.
How long did the project take you again to put all of that together? And when you first came up with the idea, did you have any idea what you'd be facing?
No. So when I was actually working on my Underground Railroad series through Darkness to Light photographs along the Underground Railroad, um, I came across, I guess Lucy Stone and some other names that became part of the suffrage movement, and they had actually flown. Look at me talking in modern times. They had taken a ship over to England in order to go to an anti-slavery British huge meeting, and they were not allowed access to the meeting because they were female, and they were a huge part of the anti-slavery movement. And so they came back to the United States, and that's where Seneca Falls came out of, the fact that they were denied access to that anti-slavery meeting. So I was aware from that research that I was interested in, just civil rights and women's rights. So then, like I mentioned, when I was back in Indiana visiting my mom and stepdad, the Indiana Historical Society, they have so much information in their library. So that's when I was back digging through. And it took me a long time to, like, I was looking at all of these different places, and there, it was a century-long struggle, so many prominent faces and women, and I just couldn't figure out how to tell the story. And then I was thinking, well, with the Underground Railroad project, I took it from one person's perspective. So I was like, well, maybe I should adopt that same methodology. But I couldn't figure out who to choose to follow or whatever. And then that's when I saw that banner, and that's when I was like, okay, that's crazy. And so then I started looking into Inez, and that's when I absolutely fell head over heels in love with her, because she just personified everything that we still, I feel like, are still fighting today. And she was so far ahead of her time. So
So
but
her first name, Inez,
uh-huh.
were her parents both, what countries did they come from? What was their?
They were both from America, but so interesting. She was very tall, and she was absolutely stunningly gorgeous. And they had lived over in London for a while, I think until maybe they moved over there when she was 12, and then they moved back to the States before she headed to Vassar College. So she actually, when she was speaking, she almost had a British accent, which I think was another reason people were completely drawn to her. Um, yeah, so I guess I don't know exactly where the name Inez came from, but yes.
That's interesting. It must have been from something they connected with in England.
Yes.
Or maybe not, but it's not, it's a name that sticks out, especially during that time. And
Definitely. Yeah. And she was exposed to the suffragette movement in England. And I never knew until I started doing all this research either that suffragette, that was I guess a British reporter, and he was reporting on that suffragette movement, but he meant it in a derogatory way, like, you little women, you don't deserve the right to vote. But they went ahead and embraced it. But in the States, it's still a derogatory term. So it was all the women said that they were suffragists. And so that's the terminology that we use in the States.
doesn't that remind you of Trump and she was a nasty woman, and how nasty became the banner on so many T-shirts, of women wearing, in pride.
Exactly, yeah. And I guess I found so many, I guess there was an entire anti-suffrage movement that was women were a massive part of it as well. They thought that women should not be out in the public eye, and they should stay at home. And so they, full circle. But anyway, so those postcards back then would actually say suffragette on them, but that was intentional because they were trying to be derogatory, because they were. So it's interesting because I kept trying to figure out what the difference in the meanings were and why I would see it in the United States and not see it. And it was usually if you see it in the States, it was meant to be derogatory.
Hmm.
I really admire your research and your taking on this project, self-motivated project. It's and the photography that you've done to um, illustrate her story. Also, one thing I found amazing was that doctors prescribed arsenic and strychnine. I mean, what was in their head?
Well, I guess she had pernicious anemia, which is common. They think now looking back, possibly she had leukemia, but of course, back then they wouldn't have known that she had leukemia. So when I mentioned that her father had had dinner and drinks with them before they went on the journey, she was covered from head to toe in bruises.
Mm.
Um, I think is it arsenic or strychnine? One of the two is still used in chemo to this day.
I was just going to bring that up,
Yeah.
that, um,
So
that is still a therapy, where we poison the body,
yes.
you
So
know.
I think so it would make her feel better and she would be able to go on. But then I think also in the end, when she was doubling and tripling up, she was slowly poisoning herself to death and did not know it. And reading about, like, she wrote to Eugen in detail about the doctor's examinations, and they were disturbing. Even though they were looking at like her head and throat, they would still do like a female exam
Yeah,
because she was so pretty.
yeah.
So yeah, it was and she definitely, so she had severe tonsillitis and she had strep throat, and they said you need to get your tonsils taken out immediately. It looks so bad, but she
Mm.
knew that if she had her tonsils taken out, she would not be able to speak and she would not be able to continue, and she was determined to do something right because she had failed with the shirtwaist. She couldn't get to the front lines. She couldn't go to the law schools she wanted to. So she was like, and I think too, she probably had some political aspirations. And I think her dad definitely had political aspirations for her. And so she wasn't going to give up. And
Okay.
it ultimately it killed her.
Yeah, my great grandfather died of pernicious anemia, which it's interesting, just coincidental.
Yeah.
So the photo of her on the train, you see her from the back. That's kind of midway through your presentation. Tell us about that photo.
So I found, let's see, I'm trying to think of the train museums I used. There's a train museum here in North Texas in Frisco. So I used some of their trains, like the one where she's boarding the train in Chicago. And then that one is from the Sacramento Museum, which they have the largest museum. They actually have private cars that you can view there. And I had never seen it. It's like literally they're decked out like houses, like from the 1916s. So, the 19 teens, like arts and crafts, Art Deco, like wooden mantles, like oak mantles and wooden beds. And so, yeah, they had actually traveled from one stop to the next. In a private car, and the press found out and just lambasted them, so they couldn't do it anymore. Even though they weren't paying for it, somebody offered them the ride. But every time they were boarding the trains, it was late at night and all the sleeping berths were already taken, and so they would have to sit up and ride. So neither one of them were getting any sleep. And Vita had sciatica, and so
Mm.
she was trying to lug they had it's not like the little rolly suitcases we had to take,
They're
they had
trunks.
the big chests, and
Yeah.
we just having to take both of them because Inez couldn't do it. So yeah, I think Vito got probably sick as well. So it was just it was like when I looked at the schedule, and if I tried to follow their schedule by our modern cars and planes, I would get sick. It was crazy the schedule that she had them on. It was just insane. And I actually took a train ride from Salt Lake City to Sacramento and overnight. And right, trying to sleep on a train is not easy. And I can't imagine like not having a sleeping berth and having all of those people around you and just being utterly exhausted. It would definitely take its toll.
Well, I enjoyed this, but I have another meeting that I have to get to. So thanks very much for your presentation. It was
Oh,
wonderful.
thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey, does anyone else have anything for
Do you
Jeanine?
think, how do you think she felt about her achievement at the end of her life?
I hope good because she made a huge impact.
Yeah,
Yeah, I really hope so, but I don't know.
yeah. They're remarkable. I mean, she just forged through so many difficult things to carry on that banner.
Yeah, she was an amazing person. That's why I chose her.
Yeah, yeah. Now, it's interesting to find someone like that who inspires you so much, you will dedicate a huge portion of your life to it, which you did. Yeah.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah. And you said there's a major exhibition schedule. Do you know some of the places that?
No, so I have it's booking now. So my Underground Railroad project and then another project that I did on the Cold War, they're being traveled by Mid-America Arts Alliance. They have a traveling arm called Exhibits USA, and they travel like all humanities stuff. And Kathy Dowell, who's the director, she has a photography background, so she gets in trouble for choosing for choosing too much photography. And then they already have two projects by the same artist, so they couldn't take this on. So I'm going to be traveling it myself. So yeah, I have the first venue, like I said, hopefully booked, and then looking for venues. So if anybody has any suggestions, let me know.
And where's the first one, did you
It's
say?
going to be here in Irving, Texas, I believe.
Okay.
Hey, Janine, and Jason speaking. First off, great presentation. I don't know if there's any famous advocates for things like the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Never Again movement after the Holocaust or the Black Lives Matter movement, but you ever considered doing a photo story on on more than just those things and doing one section where it's all combined together? Like, for example, I have a photo that I put together, a self-portrait of me in the photo studio with a hoodie that says "With liberty and justice for all." Because if only the last line of the Pledge of Allegiance were truly fulfilled, no offense if I just offended anybody with that statement of mine about the Pledge of Allegiance. But well, I put that photo together and I photoshopped the American flag in black and white in the background. A photo I took at a basketball game one night. You ever consider doing something like that?
With the different like disabilities and things, you mean?
Like, well, kind of like what you did, but also including some stories of a famous advocate for the Americans with Disabilities Act, or of someone famous who helped out with Never Again after the Holocaust and stuff like that.
I don't know. That's a good question. I have two other projects I'm working on right now. One is on atomic veterans because my father was an atomic veteran. So that project is a bit more, I guess, close to home and personal. And then I have another one that I'm starting to work on that I think came out of this suffrage movement project. But it still relates to women, but it's about so many of the research and pictures and images that I was going through of all these prominent suffrage women, they were identified as Mrs. John Smith or the wife of John Smith. And it's like, well, what is her name? Like, she is out there like trying to do something for women and we don't even know her first name. So yeah, so I'm gonna do something on that. But yeah, I'll have to think about your suggestion for once I finish those two. So, and then I have a couple others I'm finishing. I have lots of irons in the fire.
I
When
actually have my cell phone right here with my photo inside of it. Anybody like to me to hold it up?
Sure.
And
No?
Oh, that's cool.
Mhm.
I like it.
I originally bought the hoodie in Philadelphia over spring break 2 years ago, and didn't originally know what I was going to use it for back then, but I took a closer look at it shortly after the election. I realized what I could really use it for, and to help remind the nation of the one line in the Pledge of Allegiance that still needs fulfilling.
Idea.
Yeah, so it's actually going to be featured in an annual exhibition next week that I've participated in for the past 3 years, going on 4. And I originally thought of doing it last year, but a really cool sports photo of mine took the spotlight last year, and that now here it comes.
Well, great. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Okay, if nobody has anything else, I guess we'll wrap it up. I am gonna give a plug here before we go. I know Jeanine was part of this project. And my buddies, Francis Jakubik and Meg Griffiths, and a Yellow Rose project. Take a look at a Yellow Rose, especially if you are interested in the suffrage movement and the ratification of the 19th Amendment. It's a fabulous collection of work.
I think there are 50 photographers, and it's all kind of their take on women's rights or women's rights to vote.
So on that note,
I
thanks
did
everybody for coming.
I just had one quick follow-up, and that was when you say your father was an atomic veteran, do you mean he was a high energy physicist at Los Alamos, or what do you mean?
He was actually, if you Google Joint Task Force 8, um, it was called Operation Dominic. And he was the, I guess, communications officer on the lead weather ship. So during the last battery of nuclear tests in the Pacific in the early 60s, 61, 62,
Oh, okay.
before the
Oh, yeah,
nuclear
post. Yeah,
Yeah.
wait, no, yeah. Yeah.
So the lead weather ship would sit on surface zero, and then they would move 18 to 30 miles away for the detonation. And they were involved in 31 detonations.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Just curious. Okay.
Okay, Linda. We're gonna call it a night. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody, and we'll see you next month.
All
Thanks
right.
for
Thank you
having me.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very